You may have already seen this really cool project that I recently made. It's a ship's wheel. In that video I didn't make the brass hardware and there was a huge amount of comments asking to see that, so that's what I'm doing in this video. And also, to finish it off, I'll mount it to the wall. I'll get straight into it and begin on the brass hub. I've cut a couple of plywood discs and they'll get fixed either side of the hub, which will then get covered with the 1mm brass sheet. I'll try and do this with hammer forming, so the first thing I'll need is a form, which I'll make from this piece of MDF. Hammer forming is very basic, but it's a cool process. You don't need any specialist equipment, just make a form and hammer away. I've only done this once before, that was with steel, and it worked amazingly well. What I'm trying to achieve is make the brass hub look like a solid piece of brass. It'd be easier to machine it from a solid piece, but the cost would be crazy. Also, this will be super fun to make it using this method. That's the form done, but I also need a solid disc, and that's to help clamp the brass sheet down to the form. There'll be some layering done to the hub, so it won't just be a simple disc or hubcap. The layers will add depth, making it more interesting and hopefully more convincing. I'll be using a few techniques throughout the project with a real mix of hand tools and machines, so hopefully there's something there for everyone. I've cut the brass out a bit oversized, so let's clamp it to the form and start forming it. I'm thinking about making a Q&A video over the holidays. I've never done one before. Let me know if that's something you'd like to see. If it is, put your questions in the comments, ask anything, and I'll look forward to reading them. It's not a quick process, but I find it enjoyable and I love watching it slowly form into shape. It's pretty crazy how this works. The outside rim that I'm bending over is too big with too much material to fit into the shape I want, but working it with the hammer, it'll start to tighten, and it does that by moving the material into the bevel more and actually make that rim thicker than the 1mm original sheet it started out as. With all of the hammering, the brass will work harden. If I just keep going, it will possibly crack, so I'm heating it up to a red colour, which will anneal it, making it soft and easy to work again. I'm quenching it in water, but you could just let it cool down. It works either way. Annealing the brass makes a surprising difference. It really does soften it right up, making it more pliable. The top of the bevel is fairly well established, so I'll start forming the lower corner. It's an interesting technique which has endless possibilities. With a simple form you could make pretty much any shape you wanted, and it's very easy to do too. I can't remember how long this took, but it really wasn't too long. I'd say it was about 40 minutes from start to finish. Even though it's pretty well shaped, it's worth sticking at it to refine it some more. You can really sharpen up the corners with a bit more effort. I reckon it looks great. Next I'll mount it on the lathe and make it more even with some sanding. I'm using 120 grit sandpaper. I'm not looking for a finish yet, just trying to get a decent flat base with crisp corners on the bevels. I went through the same process again and made a second one for the other side of the wheel, so next I'll true up the edge of the rims. I'm picking the best one for the front. The back one will be left plain as it is, but the front one will have a lot more work done to it yet, and I'll start by cutting and releasing an outer ring. Next I'll cut a disc which will get fixed into the ring from the back. Off camera I turned down the piece left over from the inside of the ring, and that will get placed back into the centre. Next I need to mark out hole positions which will be used to fix the hub to the wheel. I've turned the plug with a centre divot to place the point of the compass in. I'll use an online calculator to work out the segments. If I have it correct, the compass should make 10 segments and land back onto the first mark. I'll solder the pieces together next, but first I need to clean up the surfaces that will be joined. I'm using a weed burner that's about 1 metre long, so not the easiest thing to control and not easy putting solder in from arm's length. It isn't pretty, but it worked. It still needs a bit of cleaning up. I'll do that later on, but next I'll etch some text onto the lowered recess, and I'll do that using the fibre laser. I'm just running a preview to check that it's all going to work okay. I'll line it up and get going with the etching. I could have etched the letters, but instead I'll etch the negative space to leave the letters raised. It's a lot more material to remove, but it will give some added depth to the hub. I paid attention to lining it up, so fingers crossed I've got it right. I set it to make a few passes which took 45 minutes. It looks great, so I'll set it to go again and I'll start working on the large dome nut. I've got these hex bar offcuts to make the nut from. This piece is tall enough to make the whole thing, but it's not quite wide enough, and this piece is wide enough but not quite tall enough. I'll make it from the two pieces and I'll start with the wider piece. After facing it off, I'll bore and thread it, and the other piece will be the dome section, which I'll solder to it later on. The thread pitch I'm using is a bit strange. I didn't give it too much thought. The bolt will be 24mm in diameter, and a 1.5mm pitch turns out to be a pretty fine thread. It's not really a problem though, and it will work fine. I should have also threaded the bar first, so I could use that for a test fit. Next I'll make the dome top piece. I'll chamfer the end, then round it over, and to work out the size of the chamfer that I need, I drew it out to scale. I need to part it off, but I'll also use the parting tool to make a tenon first. That's looking good, and I thought now would be a good time to thread the bar, which I'll use later on to mount the wheel to the wall. I wasn't sure how well it was going to fit, but it's not too bad at all, so now I can solder the two pieces together. I tried using my LPG and compressed air torch, which I'm sure would have worked, but my compressor is hopeless. I really do need to get a better one. Anyway, I fired up the weed burner again. It worked great, but again, not easy to use, being about a metre long. Now that's done, I'll check back to the laser and see how that's looking. I've been setting it to go again for about a day or so, and I reckon that looks great, so I think I'll stop at that. Another thing I did while the laser was etching was to rearrange my workshop to fit in an exciting new tool. It's a Wazer water jet cutter, which you may have already seen in my last video. It's going to be a super handy machine and pretty exciting. I'll get back to the nut and check the threads still work after applying all that heat. It's still fine, so I'll give it a bit of a clean up. I'm adding a bit more shape by introducing a subtle chamfer to the shoulder. I think I like the shape, so I'll flip it around in the chuck, face off the bottom, and cut another subtle chamfer to the underside. I need a large brass washer to go in between. I could easily do this on the lathe, but it'll be a good test piece to try out the Wazer. It seems pretty straightforward following the prompts on the control panel, and here I'm setting the height of the nozzle. It's a simple part, but it did an awesome job. I just need to file off the tabs. Next I'll mount the hub back onto the lathe and tidy up the recess. The laser didn't quite 100% line up. I've only just realised that the red laser for framing was a little bit out and needs calibrating. It looks easy enough to do though, and it's not disastrous. With a bit of a clean up it will be fine. I still need to polish it some more, but before I go too far I'll fit it to the plywood, then I'll drill the holes out and countersink them. But before I do that I need to take a skim off the top of the plywood to allow for that disc that I soldered in. I'm creeping up on the depth. I take a small amount off, check it, adjust the depth stop, and then take off more until it's just right. The biggest screwdriver that I have made a mess of the large brass screws, so as many of you have already seen in my last video, I put the project on hold and made a couple of screwdrivers. That's much better, and I really do love the new screwdrivers. Now I'll flip it over and mark out the square bore. The screws are sticking through. They were the shortest ones that I could find in stock, but when the plywood is fixed on the back, it'll be fine. I've put some masking tape around the edge to keep the plywood disc and the brass aligned. Now I'll fit the back hub and I'll cut out the square bore in that as well. I cut the square bores undersized, so I'll file them down and tidy them up. Now I'll install all of the other screws, but first I'll use a couple of screws to fix the plywood to the wheel. It's looking pretty good, but I will take the countersinks down a touch more just so the screws sit a bit lower. Next I'll take this back off, ready to polish up, but before I do that I'm going to start working on the brass ring that goes around the outside. I'll use this 0.5mm thick sheet. It's pretty thin, but when it's installed you wouldn't know how thick it is, and you'd probably guess that it was 2 or 3mm thick. I'll cut one out manually on the bandsaw and tidy it up with a bolt grinder. I need 10 of them though, so to save time I'll do the others on the Wazer. I'm really enjoying the Wazer, but I still want to show how it could be done, and if I didn't have it I would do them all by hand. I should have drilled the holes on the ends before cutting out the shape, but I forgot, so I'll grind them instead. It looks good and the correct radius. It will be sunk down into a recess, but before I do that, we'll make the rest of them. It's easy enough to line the multiple parts up in the Wazer software, choose the material, and then save the file to an SD card. This really is going to save some time. While it was doing its thing, which was about 20 minutes or so, I spent the time tidying up the workshop to keep the project moving along efficiently. I've only cut a few parts so far, so I'm still learning the best methods, but it really does do a great job. A great job, but I reckon I could have made these tabs a bit smaller and then I'd be able to just break these off. Now I need to cut them out, but that won't be too difficult. And the holes as well, I don't think I needed a tab on those. I could have just cut those completely around. They need a quick cleanup, which I definitely should have finished that without a tab. Another way would be to pierce a small hole and use that as a pilot hole and drill it out afterwards. I'm just laying them out to check them and make sure that the radius is correct. It looks pretty good, so I can write out the recess for them, but before I do that, I'll cut some small pieces that will hold the ends down and cover the joins, and I'll make those from this 1.5mm brass sheet. They're basically the same as the last parts, but much smaller, so I'll quickly get them done, and this time I'll apply what I learned from those and make the tab smaller and finish the holes. I think they'll work well, so next I'll route out a recess using a circle cutting jig. Mine is just a piece of plywood that I drill a centre hole for the job I'm working on. I measure from the bit and I'll make one for the inside radius of the recess and one for the outside. I'm super happy with that. I was pretty nervous about cutting into the wheel and getting it wrong. That's all of the brass parts made, so I'll remove them, then give them a sand and polish. I need to put a couple more coats of clear satin on the wheel as it never got the amount needed. With the brass I started on the ring, and to get a decent finish I went through 10 different grits, starting at 180 and finishing at 2000. After sanding them I used the buffing wheel to get a polished finish. They're not perfect, you can really chase your tail with polishing brass. The slightest scratch will show up, and I think there has to be a point when enough is enough. A patina's going to develop in no time at all, which I actually prefer the look of. I'll fit those pieces first before I move on to the other brass. I'll fix all of the centre holes first, which fall exactly on this joint. I'm drilling a pilot hole first, then using a tapered drill from a countersink bit, which is the perfect shape. It's wide enough at the top to allow for the wider shank of the screw. That looks pretty cool. Next I'll work on the centre hubs. I've decided to try these polishing discs on the Dremel to start with. I ended up trying these brass brushes which work pretty well. Next I'll sand the flat sections, then I'll polish the whole thing. Again, not perfect. There is the odd scratch, but I reckon I could spend another day on it and there'd still be scratches there. I'll quickly sand and polish the heads of the screws and then fit the hubs. That's the wheel finish. I just have to mount it to the wall. I'll make a bracket from this scrap of steel. It's just big enough and saves me cutting into a large sheet. I want it to be just under the size of the wheel hub, so it's fairly hidden. I'll weld on the bar that I made earlier, and I turned this piece off camera to further support it. I welded the bar to the support from underneath first, then ground that off and welded that onto the disc. I'll extend the area of the mount as the wheel has a fair bit of weight to it. I could have made the steel disc bigger, but by using plywood it will blend into the plywood wall and it will show off the wheel better. I don't have many spots to put it, but I mentioned a couple of places on Patreon and this seemed to be the choice which I was leaning towards anyway. I need to make a block for the square ball, which I'll make from this plastic. I'll drill it out, and because it's plastic it'll let the wheel spin nicely on the wall mount. In hindsight, I really didn't need to make the bore square in the wheel in the first place. When I designed the wheel I didn't give it that much thought on how I was going to mount it, and I used the square bore to make it more authentic, as an original wheel would be connected to a rudder and not spin freely. One very last piece of plastic washer. I'm super happy with it, and it's another piece to decorate the workshop. Casting a 3D print for the hub or even metal spinning may have been a better option, but I really enjoyed making the design come to life using problem solving and any method I could think of. Hopefully you like it and it inspires you in some way. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. I'd just like to say Merry Christmas and thanks for all your support over the year. Thanks for watching and I'll see you on the next one.